because if those things hadn't been there, I very easily could have seen myself going down the wrong path, very, very easily. Because if I didn't have those opportunities, it's really hard. It's much harder to get people interested in that kind of business from an investor perspective, because always the number one tip is your best investment is, that was kind of just a very common story. Oh, how do you collect your wood? And they're like, oh yeah, well, there's the women of the house grab it, but we always go as a group. And that's because of...
Welcome to Startup Journeys Founders Unplugged. Today we have a truly inspiring guest, Ben Jeffries, a multi-award-winning social entrepreneur and CEO and co-founder of ATEC, with a mission to make modern, decarbonised cooking accessible to every household by 2030. Ben's story is one of resilience, purpose, and driving positive change. As the co-founder of ATEC, Ben leads the charge in solving clean cooking and climate change through innovative IoT stoves, connecting households in emerging markets with international capital opportunities. His dedication to creating a sustainable future has earned ATEC numerous accolades and awards, including recognition from the Google Impact Challenge, DFAT Frontier Innovators, and more. In today's episode, we dive into Ben's personal journey, exploring the motivation behind his impactful work. We uncover the valuable lessons he's learned from failures, discuss the unique challenges and opportunities of funding in the social impact space, and gain insights into how Ben maintains his well-being as a founder. Stay tuned as we also explore Ben's thoughts on effective startup ecosystems and the strategies that drive positive change. If you're an entrepreneur, change maker, or simply curious about the world of impactful innovation, this episode is a must listen. Now, without further ado, let's jump into this insightful conversation with Ben Jeffries. Welcome, Ben Jeffries, CEO of ATEC Global, to the Startup Journeys podcast.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Paul.
Yeah, it's great having you on, and I'm really looking forward to hearing all about your story and all the amazing work that you're doing globally, actually. So it's an amazing story, and I guess let's just get straight into that story and share your story about founding ATEC, your company, in 2015, and what were the initial challenges you faced? I'm sure there were many, and how did you overcome them?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, my background is very much in a sort of business development area. So sort of trained in business throughout university, and was working in a few different jobs in the corporate sector, but always kind of had that idea of moving into sort of more impact work was the long-term goal. I tried to get into say corporate social responsibility out of university, but it's actually a very tricky one to just sort of actually pursue as a career path straight out of uni. So ended up in the business world, which I'm thankful for a number of years, working for some small and larger companies. And then for me, I had that opportunity to move across to impact work. So originally working for Oxfam for a number of years, and then working for a social enterprise incubator in Australia called the School for Social Entrepreneurs, and was really enjoying the work in Australia, but very much me and my wife, Lauren, had this idea I wanted to, number one, get my hands onto an actual sort of problem. It was very good being in the ecosystem side of things and supporting, but wanted to get my hands onto actually solving a direct problem myself. And number two, my wife and I had always traveled quite a lot. We'd been to about 30, 40 countries by that stage around the world. And we wanted to have an opportunity with our young kids to go and experience living in another part of the world as well. So at that stage, I was having conversations with Lizzie Brown, who was the CEO of Engineers Without Borders at that time. And then got to know Christian from Live and Learn, Environmental Education, who are the other two co-founders in ATEC. So myself and then Live and Learn and EWB. And Lizzie had said to me, yeah, between Live and Learn and EWB, they've been piloting this biodigester technology on the floating villages of the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia. And they'd pitched it to Google for the Google Impact Challenge. Google had just started off this Google Impact Challenge in Australia, and they managed to win some seed funding to basically commercialize that tech. And me and Lizzie had been talking for a while about could we do something together in the future. And yeah, she said, look, we're looking for someone with sort of both that commercial background, but then some good experience in the impact side of things as well to kick this into gear. So I went home and had a chat with Lauren, my partner, and said, hey, what do you think about moving to Cambodia? Neither of us had been there before. So we'd been all around Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, etc., but never been to Cambodia. Should we give it a go? So I then went through the process with EWB and Live and Learn, and then Small Giants as well, who through Danny, who is also one of the founders of Engineers Without Borders in Australia and the founder of Small Giants, an impact investment firm in Melbourne as well. Managed to get through that process and be selected, and picked up the family and moved off to Cambodia. So full time, we were in Cambodia for about 3 years. So it was sort of the first 3 years of getting it up and running. And I think when I turned up, we kind of, at that stage, I'd had calls with a few people and had like the proposal that I got over the line with Google, and it kind of had this sort of, hey, we've prototyped this technology, we're ready to commercialize it now into market from there. I was like, okay, cool. So, the product's ready and off we go. And turned up, and I mean, this was very clear in retrospect for all parties involved, is that there was just the product that had been prototyped was just nowhere near ready to be commercialized. It was just complete sort of prototype version that wasn't sort of built with commercialization in mind. So myself, and then I was lucky to have through EWB, a volunteer engineer called Lachlan Harris, who was with us. We were sort of there scratching our heads and going, okay, well, we built a couple more of the prototypes ourselves to see if we could commercialize it, and concluded there was absolutely no way that could be done. And so we sort of had to go back to the drawing board and start again from scratch, which was fine. We obviously had some knowledge to learn. But yeah, we had this steep learning curve, and then trying to work with a manufacturer in Cambodia, which was an absolute roller coaster to actually build our first commercial biodigester, which then also failed spectacularly. But thankfully, again, we learnt a lot. And then we went through, I think we did 3 iterations within the first 6 months, which, the manufacturer, we had to just hold on, that they wouldn't just let us go at any time and say this is all too hard. And thankfully we got through that, and started to sell the product in Cambodia.
Okay. Yeah, I want to come back later to that spectacular failure that you had, because this show is all about learning from failures. And so we'll get back to that. And I'd like to know more about you traveling around to 30 countries. Was that with your family, or?
Yeah, so that was before my wife and I had kids. So we'd done the typical, finished university, went over to Europe, spent some time in Europe, sort of working holiday. I also did an exchange in Japan as part of university as well, which was really a big experience, sort of formative experience for me as well. And then we were working in the sort of in the commercial sector for a while in Australia. Had a great life. There was a nice, clear career progression, etc. But I kind of knew that this was not for me longer term. So me and my wife, and same with the work she was doing at the time, were like, okay, well, let's save up a sort of pool of cash. One thing we'd loved our trip to Europe, but we were like working in bars, just scraping by kind of thing. We were always like, oh, we'd love to come and do some travel where we weren't scraping by the whole time. So we saved up a pool of cash. Probably should have bought a house at the time, but with that cash, that would be a much smarter idea. But it all worked out in the end. So we saved up that pool of cash, and then we set ourselves the challenge. We'd done the Camino de Santiago in Spain on our European trip last time, and so we decided we would fly back to Europe, do the Camino again, a different route, but do the Camino again with a couple of friends. finish on the west coast of Spain, and then see if we could get from the west coast of Spain back across Eurasia to Australia without taking a flight the entire way. And that was kind of the goal, try and see if we could do that in a year. And we got to Turkey, and then the Green Revolution happened in Iran. I don't know if you remember that. It was this was around 2009, I think it was. So we couldn't get into Iran. So then we ended up, I think, having to take 3 flights in the end.
Oh, okay. Okay. Pretty amazing adventure by the sound of it. So you're someone that really obviously has the travel bug, like you love traveling, I would say. And I guess from out of all of that, traveling especially to Asia and other countries, I think now your products are in Africa and Asia and other countries. And I guess if you didn't do that, ATEC may not exist, I'm guessing.
Yeah, potentially. It was. Yeah. I mean, you never know what those alternatives could be. But yeah, I mean, I think it very much helped to form our thinking around the world and doing things. And I think generally, and one thing that's a little bit of lacking in the current environment is it really helped to show me. I mean, I traveled through effectively every country across that Eurasian continent that you could think of. That there's a lot more that binds us together and a lot more common cause than there is things that separate us. And so I think that just gave me really good appreciation for understanding. Quite often we're in situations where there was no common language, and we had some of the funnest nights hanging out with people where you couldn't actually speak a common word between you. And that really gave us a good appreciation of finding ways to be able to connect with people.
Yeah, I mean, they say that words are only something like 15% of actual communication. It's intention, it's body language, it's everything else that really matters. And so I guess that's given you a much different perspective, particularly traveling to third world countries, to see how others live. And I'm just wondering, you obviously have an inner motivation to do good, to, do stuff in the impact space and help others. Was that something that you always had, or is it something that grew, or even as a child, did you have that? I mean, where does that come from?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's something I've kind of always had a bit of a drive towards this as long as I can remember. So I think I've been. It's an interesting one, and I think the travel really cemented this to me. I always had this sort of strong feeling that I wanted to give back as far as what I do, and I hopefully, I mean, there's always some level of ego there, but hopefully, it's more in the view of not as a personal drive, but more of a responsibility. And I think it's through those travels that kind of cemented to me. I always kind of had this feeling a bit like I'd been very lucky in my life. I had lots of challenges growing up. I mean, my family at that time, like we weren't doing particularly well, etc. When I was younger, but I had a mum who had the ability to get welfare payments, and then I had the ability to go to school that was government funded. I was the first person in my family to go to university, and I was able to get a HEX loan to help do that. And I'm kind of the example, I think, at a personal level of what an effective society can do for an individual. Because if those things hadn't been there, I very easily could have seen myself going down the wrong path. Very, very easily. Because if I didn't have those opportunities to progress myself and improve myself, there was a very easy path I could have taken multiple times in the other direction. So I think that really gave me that motivation, that realization of, geez, bloody lucky being born in Australia, and what we've got in front of us. So I've kind of got a responsibility to try and spread and support that kind of opportunity across the world.
Yeah, well, that's a really good motivation, and I've experienced a little bit of that myself, traveling to some Asian countries as well. Funny enough, I was at Tonle Sap that you mentioned before on the lakes there. I went out at that time. I was doing some video work with a company that did fair trading. They were making baskets and all that sort of stuff. So they were supporting the women there, and you probably know they're living on houses that are just floating, just like made out of wood, made by themselves, very primitive and just floating on the lake. And then by working for this fair trading organisation, it really improved their lives. They could send their kids to school, things that, like you said, we may just take as, that's normal here in Australia, but in other countries. And when you travel and you see that, even when I lived in the US in 1990 for a couple of years, I came back and started studying because I remember there talking to someone there said, if you want to study here, you join the army, you have rich parents, or I forget, there was something else, but that was the only sort of way that you could do it. It was very expensive. So here we have HEX, and so there's lots of opportunities, and the way that you look at things, you have that perspective that you not only see how well we can do here in Australia and how good we've got it, but it sounds like you're very grateful for that as well, and you want to help others to have the same sort of conditions, I guess, which is
exactly. And it's kind of funny. I was talking about this with Wilm, who's our lead engineer. We were over in India and Bangladesh earlier this year, and then coming back to Australia. And I mean, you go to Bangladesh, somewhere like Bangladesh, the population is crazy. It's actually the most densely populated country per square kilometre in the world. It's 170 million people in about a country about the size of Victoria. So it's just absolutely intense. Dust, pollution, etc. But the optimism in the people there is just amazing. And same in a lot of, when I've been to Africa, multiple countries in Africa, Cambodia as well, India, Nepal, all these countries, you feel this optimism in the people. And you come back to Australia, where we're really, actually, we are the lucky country. And you feel this kind of pessimism in the air. Everyone's worried about house prices and mortgages and cost of living and this and that and culture wars or whatever the case is. And it's almost kind of chuckling to yourself going, man, it's our happiness is such a relative concept. Like, these people are so optimistic about the future because they've recently seen what their parents have come from and are so grateful for the opportunities that are now coming their way, despite all the many challenges they still have. And I think generally we've got a bit of this feeling in the West of almost forgetting how much has been laid down before us by our previous generations and how lucky we actually are. So I think that's always one of the advantages of travel, of experiencing other cultures, is really not that experience, but how it helps you to reflect on how things are back home.
I think so too, and it's really good, I think, for younger people to travel early, maybe when they leave school or whatever, and go to some of these countries and experience in that, and then that can sort of change the way they think about things as well, and be more grateful and understand how good we've got it here. So, Ben, before you talked about like a major failure, and as I said, this show is all about learning from that. So can you talk about that? So what happened, how you dealt with it, and then, how you got through it, or how you didn't get through it, or how you dealt with it, I guess, and what were the outcomes?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think if we really want to get into that, that sort of that view of failure as an entrepreneur at a startup, I think it's a very valuable conversation to have. I think that's probably one of the defining features that separates an entrepreneur from a standard business person is that comfort with failure, and seeing it as a learning opportunity rather than a failure in itself. When I started ATech off, along with EWB and Live and Learn, I picked up a couple of books to kick me off. One was The Toyota Way, which was because I didn't have much experience in manufacturing, so I wanted to understand more about manufacturing from the best, so reading The Toyota Way. Then the other one was The Lean Startup by Eric Rice. And very much I'd been kind of through the Social Enterprise Incubator, SSE, and had been quite a good understanding and comfortable with this idea of sort of this lean startup approach of sort of build, measure, learn. And it's not so much about whether it's successful or not, whether you fail or succeed at that particular point, but having a clear hypothesis, testing it, learning, and it's your ability to iterate through that process as quickly as possible that is the goal, rather than success in and of its own. And so I think that's something I held pretty close to myself throughout the process, is just to look as failure as one step on that process. But it's brutal at the same time. Like, it's not like it's a fun experience,
No.
particularly like, that first time you fail, like, by the first biodigester and it kind of failed, and you got manufacturer kind of yelling at you going, well, why the hell isn't this product working? And you said you'd be able to order all this stuff from us, and we put in all this time, blah, 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 and you've got to manage that. And it's like, okay, cool. It's all part of the process. No worries. And then you build the second one and it fails.
Yeah.
And then you've got the guy yelling at you even more
Yeah.
at that stage of the process, and
So,
your
so
team.
that first time, that
Yeah.
first failure, and that guy yelling at you, and then how did you feel after that? And then how did you get through it?
Look, I think by the first time it wasn't too bad, because that was the sort of, I kind of knew it may work, it may not work. So that's fine. It's like, hey, we learn a lot. Let's go again. By the second time, and it was still failing, that's when it started getting a bit awkward. That's when it was like, oh shit, okay, is this actually going to come through? But I was like, hey, you know what? We learned so much the first time. We've learned everything we need to learn by the second time. So it's fine. I'll convince the guy, look, let's go the third time around. And then we did the third time around, and it still basically wasn't working quite as we thought as well. And it was at that stage, it's that repetitive failure. I think more than just talking about failure as a startup, it's more about how you deal with repetitive failure. And the really what gets you through that, I don't know. I think it's partially a mindset thing, of you just need to be the kind of person that can just, I mean, it can be a learned skill, it can be inbuilt. I'm not sure what the split is between.
Where does it come from in you? Where do you get that emotional strength? I guess because I've been through the same thing, and you sort of, there's different ways of dealing with it, and some you have to pick up and you have to keep going. But we all have sort of a different way of dealing with that. And where do you get the inner strength or where did you get the inner strength to deal with that stuff and keep moving on instead of just giving up?
Yeah, so I'd start with stubbornness. That's probably the first factor there, of just going, nah, I'm just going to keep going. That's probably one, and that can be both good and bad, because you've got to sometimes be stubborn and sometimes just realize when you're wrong. The second is probably humor in that situation. And I mean, that's where we'll talk about that trip before. It had given me a good perspective on humor. I used to get sort of fairly angry or upset about things sort of earlier on. And I think that trip, and I mean, we hit multiple crazy situations throughout that trip, etc., where I kind of went, okay, things are going to happen, and there's no point kind of getting upset about them. And then the third one was just sort of probably conviction, just going, yeah, look, I mean, the conviction for me was the outcomes around solving this cooking problem, of actually, getting people off cooking with wood or charcoal onto a modern clean cooking solution. I mean, it's the leading cause of premature death in women across the world. It's one of the leading causes of malnutrition through, effectively, it's like kids being exposed to a pack of cigarettes a day. It leads to the villi in the intestine being underperformed, underdeveloped, sorry. And it's also released about a gigaton of emissions into the world each year, which is more than the global airline industry. So I kind of sit there and I look at it and go, okay, this is a solvable problem. We've already solved it in the developed world. We can solve this in the developing world. It has all these benefits. There's got to be a way to make this work. And so it was a conviction in the reason that we were here and why we exist. And I think that the modern version or the most recent version of that for us now is that conviction of why we're here is still there. And I think then you sort of get into a position of going, okay, well, what's our role in that? So I don't think the conviction in that the problem needs to be solved has been changed. But it's like a question of, okay, well, what's our role? So in the early days, it was just go, okay, maybe we can help a few Cambodians with this problem. Then it became, okay, we could actually do this across multiple countries. And then it became, okay, actually, we could actually do this across multiple products, across multiple markets. etc. But then it's just the problem's too big. We're talking 800 million households. We're never going to be able to like impact everyone, obviously. So now we see ourselves as playing a role in sort of showing what's possible in how you can solve this problem as well.
Yeah, yeah. So when I interviewed Cameron Neal from Red Hat Impact, he had a major problem with software they were developing, and went on for about a year and a half, and they lost a lot of money. But he said he kept going because he still had his purpose, which was to help all those impact startups. So I guess really from what you've said as well, you have the purpose to help all those women. And I read on your LinkedIn that there's 3.5 million women that die every year collecting wood to burn on the stoves to cook their meals, which is crazy. Like, tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, basically it's like smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. So the smoke exposure that happens to women in that area is just through the roof. They're the ones predominantly in the kitchen in most countries. And so they're over a wooden stove and, exposure. It's everything from cataracts to pneumonia to emphysema to a variety of other health problems. So yeah, it's actually, more than traffic accidents every year. I think it's 2 or 3x traffic accidents of premature death.
Well, and I've heard also that in some countries as well, when women go and try and collect the wood, they can be attacked and all sorts of things happening. It's quite dangerous as well.
Yeah. I was just in Nepal a few months ago because we're setting up in Nepal at the moment, and yeah, that was kind of just a very common story. Oh, how do you collect your wood? And they're like, oh yeah, well, there's the women of the house grab it, but we always go as a group, and that's because of safety concerns. And they never go too far away from their sort of village as well, again, because of safety concerns. So, I mean, they're kind of making it work, but if you add up the time of cooking with wood, it's around 20 hours per week compared to a modern cooking solution. So you basically, it takes you half a working week to cook for your family, which you think about that compared to our experience of cooking. It's just a ridiculous lost opportunity for women to better their lives. So not only you've got the health side, you've got the economic side as well.
Yeah, and tell us a bit more about the stove, because I was having a look at some of your videos, and apparently you put the saucepan on the stove and it only heats the area of the saucepan, so it doesn't use a lot of electricity, and it's all connected by Internet of Things. And tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so generally what we're looking to do is to go, how can we make sort of that clean modern cooking affordable and accessible to everyone on the planet? That's kind of our overarching goal. And to do that, we have two products: the biogas product, which takes typically cow manure and converts it into biogas, which you can use like LPG and then fertilizer as well. That's sort of our original product. And then we have a second product now, which is the one you mentioned, the electromagnetic induction cooking. So with that setup, that's a high efficiency electric induction stove. So similar to if anyone's got a Bosch stove like I have in my home in the developed world, it's just a very high efficiency electronic device. But with both products, going back to what I said before, what we're trying to do is obviously people's financial capacity to buy these products to better their lives is fairly limited. But they are sitting on a relatively large untapped asset, which is their emission reductions. So for each of these households, they can reduce global emissions by anywhere from sort of 2 to 6 tons per annum by switching from cooking with wood to modern cooking under such a situation. And so what our job is and our role is to help them to tap into that opportunity, because effectively it's a decentralized opportunity. And for them to monetize that into a carbon credit, which they can then sell as a revenue stream into a global market, it's just completely unfeasible on an individual household level. And what our technology, our IoT technology, basically every stove has a SIM card in it, is it's a sort of demand and supply aggregator. So we take a decentralized problem, we effectively connect that into effectively a matrix of stoves, and then we're able to aggregate that together into a project and then be able to sell those carbon credits for those people on international markets. So that achieves the fantastic social health outcomes. And then it obviously means they're cutting down less trees. And then that means that they're able to convert that environmental impact into an actual revenue stream for the household.
Yeah, it's amazing. You're helping all these women, and you're helping, the environment. Like, there's so many impacts there. I was going to ask you a question about funding, because this podcast is geared mainly towards new and early stage startup founders. And I go back and think about, my early times in the startup ecosystem. One of the hardest things to do is to get funding. And I know, talking with Cameron, there's a big gap. I think in Australia alone, it's a $90 billion gap for, between, let's say, the mums and dads sort of investors and the angel $1 million on VC type investment. And, the impact area is quite difficult to get funding. I was just wondering if you could tell us about your funding for ATEC and how you went about that, and any advice for other founders in a similar situation in the impact space for how they can go about that as well.
Yeah, I might start with the last point first, because this is kind of what I wish people had told me in the early days as well. So I think a couple of key things. Number one, look at the type of business you are as a category, and then you need to be realistic of how attractive that's going to be for investors. So if you look at the majority of investors, they're going to be predominantly interested in software style businesses. And that's because you can keep a relatively low OPEX cost base while expanding revenue significantly over time, and it tends to have some kind of recurring revenue structure towards it. So if you're an impact startup and you're a software business, good times. You should be able to get out there. If you've got a good idea and you've got a good team, then you should be able to go out there and find investors who are interested at the various stages of that process. And you can usually bootstrap it in the early days to get a sort of MVP or whatever going from there. If you're not in the software business, if you're in, say, let's take like what we're in, which we're kind of in the hardware business. I mean, we're kind of progressing into IoT and software as well. So we're kind of like I don't know if it's the right use of the term, but like a sort of stack of technologies, etc. It's really hard. It's much harder to get people interested in that kind of business from an investor perspective, because, and same with if you're a distribution business as well, because with those companies, your costs tend to scale closer to your revenue than a pure software play as such. So generally what you're going to find, and in the early days, it's not too bad, because maybe you can get some investor. I mean, you've got the sort of friends, fools, family stage one, you've got sort of your angels, and then your impact investors. A lot of those guys will do that small ticket stuff, and are not too concerned about the less of a priority on of hardware, distribution, software, whatever the case may be. Once you then start to move up into that next phase of funding, though, if you are dealing with impact investors, they're much larger ticket sizes, and they tend to be more VC style, or you're working into the typical VC market from there. That's when it becomes quite a challenge. So that valley of death, sort of between seed to Series A, around that, which is a common story in startup world, I think is particularly prominent in impact startups. And we have one large factor working against us, which is we're generally dealing with either a problem or a market that is not commercially attractive, because if it was commercially attractive, someone would have already solved that problem. And I think that's a good thesis to start with, is to go, okay, well, why hasn't this problem already been solved if it was attractive? So you're almost starting on a back foot from the start with the VCs, because you're probably solving a problem where the commercials don't stack up, because otherwise someone from the commercial sector may have probably already done it. So I think that's a good point to start off with. And then depending on what you are, if you're software, just go straight into the VC market. If you're more in, say, be it hardware, distribution, sales, etc., then you're probably looking more at those philanthropic sort of impact investors as well. Now, the downside of that is, I mean, for example, we're working in carbon markets. We know multiple sort of pure software plays for carbon market stuff, and they can get that funding at the early stage, which is great. A lot of them throwing in blah 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 AI, blah 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 data, blah 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 blockchain, etc. Whatever the buzzwords are right now. And I'm a big fan of all those techs, but it's like, okay, that's all good, but literally I'm talking to like 5 of them, all kind of trying to offer the same thing, and their moat or their sort of defensible position is actually a lot lower. So it's easy to raise that money. It's probably harder to have a defensible position into the future. Well, if you can get through those brutal early stages, be it in hardware, hardware distribution, etc., it's really bloody hard to get to that next level. And then you're actually in a very defensible position. So the durability of your competitive advantage is going to be a lot stronger than a pure software play as well. So I think those businesses, harder to raise money in the early days, but more defensible once you get there. I mean, you look at someone like a Tesla, for example, they're effectively a full stack solution. They've got all this stuff going on. It's bloody brutal for them up to about 2019. But they made that breakthrough, and then off they go. While the pure software guys, you can accelerate a lot faster, but your defensible position becomes harder and harder over time, I would say. Always the number one tip is your best investment is sales revenue. Like if you can sell product and generate margin, that's by far always the best one. So I think this has changed in the last couple of years as we've hit a bit more of a sort of equity winter conditions with what's going on at a macro level. I think we used to structure a lot of businesses or a lot of startups under this idea of, okay, how do we maximize its investability? And that whole game's kind of changed now. Like no one talked to me about unit economics in 2020, and EBITDA was not a big concern. And now it's all any investors will talk about. So they want to see proven businesses with good margins before investing. And the whole market's in a bit of flux. And I think equity investors are relatively risk off unless you're hitting one of those sort of key buzzwords. But I mean, it's not kind of are going to be available or workable in all situations, solutions. So focus on the venture building as much as possible in those early days. And if that's successful, regardless of what's happening at a macro level, then the investment will come if you need it. Mm. Yeah, and we do have one advantage in the impact sphere around this, which is we can tap into grant funding that typically you wouldn't be able to get as a business. So this is Aussie startup discussion. So first of all, the Australian government R&D tax incentive. If you're doing a startup, I didn't know about it for the first couple of years. That's just effectively a grant from the government that you get back as a reimbursement of some of the taxes you would have paid over the course of the year. That's hugely valuable. So every startup in Australia should be tapping into that. And then, if you're in the impact space, then your ability to generate grants as that early stage risk capital is there. So that's quite advantageous. Some people in our sphere kind of have this anti-grant view, which is like, oh no, a startup should never have to rely on grants, blah, blah, blah. I don't think it's a particularly strong view. It's sort of based in strong reason. It depends on what you're using the grants for. If you're using grants in an equity style manner to grow the business with effectively no return on capital required, it's a bloody smart idea. Equity investors should be cheering that on because effectively you're just getting free equity into the business. If it's helping you to build the business, such as a results-based financing mechanism, it's fantastic. You should be cheering that on. If it's mission drift and whatever, that's fine. But there kinds to be almost this sort of cynicism, this kind of superiority cynicism bit that, grants, a successful business doesn't need that or whatever. It's like, but we're not dealing in we're not dealing in sort of normal, easy or sort of commercial market conditions. We're often in very constrained market conditions in the developing world or with a very difficult problem to solve. So you kind of got to have that hybrid that an impact startup can tap into.
Yeah, absolutely. And startups need a lot of energy going into them because, they're all new ideas that haven't been out there before, and much harder to sell and to get going. And I think it's 1 in every 12 startups actually succeed. So it's a high rate of startups not succeeding. Yeah, and so that's what this podcast's about. People like yourself that have been there, done that, and have had failures, had hiccups, had problems, but there you are now, and you've got your product, in different countries around the world, doing a lot of good for climate change and for all these families and women that need that help. So I applaud you on that. It's fantastic.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I was going to add though, but I still don't see ourselves as successful yet. So I mean, we're still here. That's kind of good. We still had a lot of impact, which is great. But I still feel like we're at the start of the journey, and that's what 7-8 years I think we've been around for now. And I think that's generally one thing that's underestimated too. Again, it depends on your business type, but quite often to really break out, we're right on the edge of that breakout sort of stage. There's a great concept from Jim Collins around the flywheel. That's another thing I really recommend people to look into is Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, and he has an addendum to that called Turning the Flywheel. It's brilliant. We're really on the edge of that breakout right now, which is great, but we're literally in those sort of last turns before it really breaks out from there. So, and that's 8 years in. So, I mean, and this is not just impact. If you look at a lot of really good, successful startups, it took a long time before they really broke out.
Oh yeah. People talk about overnight successes, but it's like 10 or 20 years behind that sometimes.
Yeah.
So that's one misconception as well. Some people that maybe even some younger people or not, like, I want to get into a startup. It's going to be awesome. In 6 months. Look, to be honest, like even myself, right? I didn't know anything about the startup world 6 years ago, and I just was doing something that I thought could really help the education industry. With 360 scenarios where you place, workers or students in the workplace and they have to deal with situations. So, and then I didn't know anything about a startup. Didn't have any business background, and I thought, 6 months and we should be selling this and getting it out there. 6 years later, so everything blew out. We had COVID in the middle, and it's not an easy journey, but it's one that I really enjoyed. So I wouldn't put anyone off that, particularly people that are younger or people that have the means to do something like this. Just get out. If you believe in something, just get out there and do it and try it and learn as you go and listen to these sort of podcasts and mentors that can help you.
Yep.
So
and there was that great quote which I think we talked about the other week around from Mark Andreessen out of the Hard Thing About Hard Things book, which I think Mark Andreessen's quote, which I think was meant to be a joke, was, "You only ever experience two emotions in a startup: euphoria and terror." And I find that a lack of sleep enhances them both. So, and I just read that recently and I just laughed. I was like, yeah, that pretty much sums it up.
That's why I'm laughing, because if you've been a startup founder for a while, you absolutely, because that's how it is. And just around that as well. So dealing with those sort of situations, like how did you, make sure that your mental health and everything stayed okay? Or what do you do to deal with that, with your own wellness, and make sure that you can deal with this roller coaster ride of being a startup founder?
Yeah, look, it's the mental health side is not discussed anywhere near as much, I think, as it should be. Most startup founders I know are either currently burnt out or have been burnt out in the past. And that's kind of one of the gears you just kind of got to go through. Generally is going to happen sooner or later. It could be for a variety of reasons, but it's hard. I think impact entrepreneurs in particular they tend to have obviously a very strong drive for the impact they're achieving. They're not in it just to make money, kind of thing. And generally, I find most startups, no matter what you call them, they're the ones that are really successful tend to have some kind of higher purpose or drive that they're looking to do, regardless if they're full commercial or call themselves impact or whatever. There tends to be something. So I don't think it's unique. But I notice with impact entrepreneurs in particular, they really deeply concerned about the problem that they're trying to solve. And that means they'll quite often push through really, really hard very early on. But I think it's probably common across all. I can only sort of speak to my experience, but I imagine that's for a variety of reasons. You just don't want to see the damn thing fail. That's the main thing. So you kind of start off and you do that, and then it's almost like, you know, the mental equivalent of you know, being a slightly talented athlete who's then trying to become a professional athlete, and you suddenly realize, oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't, you know, maybe I need to get good sleep. Maybe I need to actually look at my diet, and I need to look at exercise and routine and etc. Because effectively your typical day is you're always going to have an overload of priorities from there. And I mean, it's different in that you need to very much build those opportunities. Like if you don't do anything, nothing will happen, which is a bit different from, say, the typical corporate setup where there just tends to be things happening regardless sometimes of your contribution, because you're sort of part of a bigger machine. As a startup founder, you are the generator of momentum. So, but you're going to have too many things to do. So you need to become very disciplined, very productive. Like I've changed my diet. I've had to put in place health schedules. I've got this Aura ring which tracks my sleep, like all these things, because I've had to have a hard look at various parts of my life because I'm doing this startup thing, but also I've got a wife and 3 kids, and I don't want to be the founder that ends up with a successful business at the cost of his family. So I've got to balance those things out as well. And so you keep looking at ways to optimize and improve yourself. I think but you've got to look across all those areas: sleep, diet, exercise, etc., and just continue to look at ways to efficiently improve. My latest one is doing Tabata routines at lunchtime. It's like literally 12 minutes and you get a really good workout. So that kind of works for my lifestyle. I could never go to the gym. Not really much of a gym fan, but I want to have that daily exercise. I do a morning sort of short yoga and breathing session each day to kick off the day as well. And again, that's just about keeping my mental stability. I follow a low carb keto style diet, etc. Again, that's just so I used to crash after lunch, and now my energy is much more consistent. So it's had these benefits. Burnt me out at the same time, but hopefully you kind of coming out the other end, still surviving.
I think that's really great advice. Pretty much everything that you're doing, you know, like good sleep, good exercise, good diet, you know, taking some time out as well. I interviewed Graham Cowan, he was instrumental in creating Are You OK Day. He's got We Care 365. So he had a really, really severe breakdown himself. He was depressed for 5 years, and he came out of that. And then now he advises people. So, you know, for those that are interested more in the wellness aspect, Graham's got some great tips, and pretty much, Ben, you covered a lot of that. So you're doing a lot of that. And it's interesting as well because Graham talks about a study by Google, a really big study about the most effective teams. And one of the biggest points of the most effective teams were ones that thought they were doing something good or something that had impact. That was really, really important. And also that got on with the other people in the team, that was friendly, they felt like they enjoyed it. That was way more impactful than anything else, you know, about the skills or capability or anything else. So, so that was interesting study. And so I'd say you're doing all the right things, and I would strongly recommend, particularly new or any founders, look after your health, because even if you do have a successful startup, you haven't got your health, you haven't got anything actually. You know, so it's all about the journey as well. You know? Yeah,
it's a stressful process. So it is. Man, you got to find ways to manage that stress. Otherwise, you're going to lash it out on those around you. So, and then that's typically when you're failing personally or professionally.
Yeah, interestingly, I talked to a psychologist years ago, and she was saying, we're talking about, the ups and downs. She said, look, from 1 to 10, when something great happens, just try and go from 5 to 6, maximum 7. And when something really bad happens, don't go lower than 3. So try and maintain between really 4 and 6. So don't get overexcited, because then you'll come down even more later. So I employed that, in my startup as well. Like if great things happen, you get some breakthrough, okay, just take it easy, because tomorrow is going to be some major issue anyway. And when that happens, okay, just it'll be okay. We'll get through it, type of thing. So I thought that was some really good advice.
Yeah, and that makes me think of one really good tip to share as well is like, and I think that was from Ben Horowitz's book as well. He was talking about you're constantly presented by problems from your team that you're expected to solve that you have absolutely no idea about. And I think that's a common thing. And I think my advice there, like, first of all, you got to encounter those situations constantly. People look to you for answers when you have no idea yourself. And, sometimes you need to just be like, yeah, cool. What do you guys think? Okay, let's just do it, kind of thing, and go for it. And then sometimes you'll get that sense when it's a really big decision. And I think there's quite often that pressure to give an answer in the time. But to actually, I think for me, it was learning that skill to be able to just stop in that situation, slow down a little bit and go, okay, let me think about it and come back to you guys. And you've got to make sure you follow through and actually come back to them, but not feeling like you need to make that decision right on time every time with people.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Yep, excellent. So, Ben, you've worked in different sort of early stage innovation ecosystems, or you've been involved in that. Like for you, how important do you think that is for startups to be in one of these ecosystems, and what benefits do you think they can derive from being in the ecosystem and the connections that they can make there?
Yeah, so I think there was a study, I can't remember, it was when I was with SEC, but I remember hearing and thinking, yeah, that rings pretty true. It was about what makes a entrepreneur successful. What was the common trait? So they studied a bunch of entrepreneurs and looked for the common traits, and it came down to 2. It wasn't anything to do with skills or background or blah blah blah. That wasn't the common trait. It was generally a propensity to action. So people actually just get in there and do stuff, which we all tend to be. If you're looking at doing a startup, it's generally because you have a propensity to action. And the second one is to have a network that can help you to get answers to questions that you don't know yourself, and how important that is, or get advice constantly. And that's where I think the ecosystem plays a really good role. I mean, there's some good fundamental focus stuff around skills building that happens in a lot of the sort of accelerators and startups. And yeah, that's quite valuable. But the biggest one is that connection with fellow entrepreneurs. And having run a accelerator myself, and then being part of a couple, there's almost, or there is too much of a focus on having this curated agenda and schedule. So you get everyone together. We're going to get this person in to talk about finance and this person talking about that. When literally all you need to do is get some good startup founders, put them in a room, and just let them talk for a while. Like literally, just let them go at it, and then kind of present something back to the group, because they will find the answers to the problems most easily from those peers. So I think that's really the big one. The one that I'm in.
And that's what this startup's really about as well, Ben, because I'm talking to all the founders that have that experience, and if new startup founders listen to this, a lot of their problems can be solved, or a lot of mistakes that we've all made, they can be lessened.
Yeah, and Paul, maybe that's an idea for future podcast as well, is for you to sort of facilitate or bring a couple of different people together, and they can just kind of bounce off. It could be a complete disaster.
No, actually, it's interesting you're saying that, because I was just thinking yesterday about doing that, because I've been thinking a lot about the funding in the impact space. And I interviewed Nick McNaughton, who is a VC of many years, who was a great mentor where I was, the ecosystem I was working at Macquarie University. And and talking with Cameron and others, and like, it'd be great to have a bit of a forum on, okay, how can we resolve this problem of funding type of thing, so we could have it on different topics and nut things out. I think that could be something I do in the future as well.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how you brought that up, but it's so true, isn't it? And as well, because we're similar, like founders can relate to each other, and even going back to mental health, it's really important that you have regular meetups with people that you get on with. I mean, even Graham talks about once a week he meets these friends on Sunday to go for a walk on the beach and talk about issues, and they're open to all of that. All of that helps our mental health as well. So it's a really interesting point that you made, and I totally agree with it.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, getting the most energizing conversations I've had over the last 8 odd years are with fellow entrepreneurs. And I mean, we all have very unique experiences, but it's finding those commonalities. And quite often it's finding like I had one, I'm part of the Unreasonable Fellowship, which is a global one, mainly in North America. It's kind of, I think, where majority of their network is, but amazing group. And we were trying to raise money earlier this year, and it was just brutal. And I was like, shit, maybe it's just us. Maybe we're just crap, kind of thing. And went and caught up with everyone. And it was like, basically everyone was exactly the same experience of going, yeah, it's just brutal out there. Like, my business is better than any other round I've ever raised, and I'm finding it so much harder to find investors. And then I went, and as part of that trip, I stopped in to San Francisco and Silicon Valley and met with some VCs and talked to a couple who were previously been in startups, and they're like, yeah, it's really bloody hard at the moment, kind of thing. And just getting that validation from peers that, oh, okay, yeah, cool. It helps you to focus on, okay, well, what is my problem versus what is a systemic challenge or whatever at the moment, and then what can I actually do about it? Because that's quite often the hardest thing, is to go, okay, well, what's within my control, where is my direction, finding that, and then off you go.
Yeah, great advice. So just wrapping up, Ben, so based on your journey, what advice would you give aspiring entrepreneurs, especially those venturing into the social entrepreneurship and clean technology space?
Look, I think we've probably covered most of those key points. I think the really good one is if you're right at the start of that journey, you're probably either going, okay, I really want to do this work, is sort of scenario one. So go find a good organization that sort of aligns with your values, particularly in the carbon market space. I think our ability to track and trade carbon emissions is going to be one of the biggest opportunities for both impact and commercial as well over the next 20 years. And I think it's a fascinating space and something that's going to grow significantly. So I really recommend looking at that area. But whatever your interest is, try and find someone already doing it. Then if you've got a great idea, you're probably not the first to come up with that idea either. So again, try and find, okay, who's done something similar to this, and again, maybe go work for them for a bit. Is probably the best way to go. Or if it's truly unique, which is probably unlikely, but if it's truly unique, then yeah, try and get as many good people around you as possible. But try and surround yourself. I think the general thing there is surround yourself with like-minded people. You can achieve more together than you can just by yourself.
Fantastic advice. So Ben, if you were to start over again with everything that you've learned, what would you do differently and why?
Yeah, it's a hard question because I don't know in some ways whether like it's a false conclusion, because I could say, oh yeah, I wish I'd done this, and then yeah, maybe it had worked out, or been better or easier or whatever the case may be. Because I just don't know. The fact we're here, ATEC's here. The fact is kind of sort of we must be doing something right. The fact that we still exist, and we're still able to keep on the mission that we're doing. So I think that's, first of all, it's hard to kind of go, well, maybe we should have done something differently. The only one that I can think of that's, again, probably just a good general tip is, I think one of the biggest challenges we had is the products we were designing, we are not the target customer for, as far as us as our team. So even though, I mean, our team is 95% from the developing world, so we are overwhelmingly people from the countries in which we work, but they're city people in those countries. They're like, you know, university graduate, and we're mainly working into rural households. I think those that have the ability to design a product and then use it every day. I mean, we kind of do that with our induction stoves. We use it as frequently as possible as well. But having that first-hand experience of the problem and then the solution ongoing will make your journey much, much easier, because you're effectively building your own iteration loop of just using the product every single day from there. So I think that's, I don't know if I'd say I'd do it differently, but I'd be very cognizant in future if doing another startup of going, okay, is this a problem I'm going to continue to experience on a daily basis myself personally, and the solution that I'm proposing to solve it. And that would kind of be one of the tick boxes for me that go, okay, yeah, I'm going to have a good chance of success here.
Excellent. Well, thanks for that. So I think we'll wrap it up now, Ben. And I think there's a lot of wisdom and a lot of fantastic advice for new and early stage startup founders. And I'm sure they'll get massive value out of this podcast. And really appreciate you being on today. And thank you for all the amazing work you're doing, you know, for climate change, for all those women in third world countries and everything else that you're doing that is having the impact that is so needed in this world.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Paul. And yeah, if people want to know more about us, our website's atechglobal.io. We're probably most active on LinkedIn. If you want to follow us on LinkedIn, just look for ATEC Global or ATEC Australia International on LinkedIn. And yeah, very happy to come on today, and yeah, hopefully have a chance for another conversation in the future.
Yeah, maybe you can be a part of the forum we were talking about.
Sounds awesome. Thanks, Paul.
And I'll leave all those links in the show notes as well. Anything else that you want to leave there, some of the things you mentioned as well in the books, we'll leave that all in the show notes. Thanks so much, Ben. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Paul.